Professor Tim Noakes. Thanks very much for joining us. If you could just explain to us, just give us a little story about who Professor Tim Noakes is, your origins and your science and running and everything.
Sure. My parents immigrated from Britain at the end of the Second World War. They went to Zimbabwe, and the first house they built was right next to the person who had discovered the Sterkfontein caves and said that if Raymond Dart and Broom went and dug at Sterkfontein, they would very likely discover early Australopithecus remains. And he did that when he was a medical student. So that introduced me to origins and the origins of the human species and the role of South Africa in that whole story. And
Where exactly are the Sterkfontein caves for the international audience?
The Sterkfontein caves are just outside Johannesburg, and it is now part of the cradle of humankind, really developed by Philip Tobias over the last 20 or 30 years. And that is where the largest number of pre-hominids, the Australopithecus africanus, have been discovered. So I was, without knowing it, I had a link to the paleo and the evolutionary theories of human evolution. I then went to high school, had no idea what I was going to do with my life. And I was in America on an exchange program on December the 3rd, 1967, when Professor Christian Barnard performed the first human heart transplant about 2 miles from here at Groote Hospital. And I heard that reported on the radio the very day. And I then, 3 months later, I woke up one morning and my brain said, "You will study medicine at the University of Cape Town." And I did. Then I went a year later and went and enrolled and studied medicine. And there was really the most interesting thing about my medical career is that I never learned how to use drugs. I had this complete block to use pharmacological agents. And I couldn't learn these names and I couldn't learn their actions.
That's brilliant.
I'm probably the only doctor to graduate from the University of Cape Town without having a clue how to treat any common illness. I could probably treat 3 or 4 conditions.
Well, with our film and what we're doing, I think you're a modern day hero in that case.
Because all I was interested was in sports medicine. Because I became an athlete at the university. I first rode and had some fabulous experiences, and then I started running and ran the Comrades Marathon, which is a 90-kilometer or 56-mile race. And I had the perfect experience. I had the most blissful day in my life on that race. And it was because I was eating a high-fat, high-protein diet.
And way back then, yeah?
But what happened next, that was 1973, what happened next is we converted to this high-carbohydrate diet, and my running went downhill, and I became fat. And ultimately, 4 years ago, I realized that this wasn't the eating way for me to eat.
So how long were you in that stage of the
33 years. I ate the high-carb diet for 33 years. And I wrote the book Law of Running, which many people say is the Bible of running. And there it says, eat high-carbohydrate diets. And it's a whole chapter on nutrition. And I've torn that chapter out on video for Serial Killers, the documentary. which actually, when I read it, it wasn't quite so bad. But the point was that I was in groupthink. And when you're in groupthink, there's no benefit to change. So 4 years ago, I had this epiphany. And within 2 hours, I read Westman, Finney, and Volick's book called The New Atkins for the New You. And within 2 hours, I said, these are great scientists. I knew about them because we'd also done high-fat studies in the 1980s, and we showed that they were actually quite beneficial for some athletes, not for all athletes, but some athletes did really well on those diets. And we published 2 papers in the 1980s actually claiming that these diets were better than high-carbohydrate diets. That's the conclusions. When I look back at those papers, I don't believe them. I think they're too good to be true. Something was going wrong. And I think what happened was that the athletes wanted to please us on this high-fat diet, so they performed better than they should have in the laboratory. And of course, in the 1980s, we didn't understand what we call the placebo effect, that if you believe, then the outcome will be different. And so the irony is that if you look at all the studies on high-fat diets in athletes, we did quite a few of them. And most of the ones we did were positive, except one. And that was the best study. And it showed a small difference. In other words, the high-fat diet, they didn't do quite as well. Now, the world grabs that one and remembers that study, but ignores all the other studies, which is really interesting. Because the same lady who did that study did another study for a PhD, but it was a study of people cycling for 8 hours. And in that trial, the high-fat diet did slightly better than the high-carbohydrate diet, but we didn't have enough numbers. And so that paper never got reported. So that begins, yeah.
Okay.
So one begins to learn how science becomes corrupted. So I was corrupted myself because I couldn't see that we'd actually done work which suggests there might be a role for a high-fat diet. But if you read Law of Running, you wouldn't pick up that message.
Yeah.
So anyway, having taught that we must eat high-carbohydrate diets, I then have this epiphanous moment, and I read this book by Westman, Folick, and Finney, The New Atkins for the New You, and I looked at all the science, and the back there was 150 references to studies which I knew nothing about, and I'm a biologist.
Yeah,
So-
just to put everybody in the picture, I mean, you are the professor of sports science medicine here. You were the founder, alongside, was it Mornay du Plessis,
Correct.
of the Sports Science Institute in Cape Town. You're probably the most qualified professor that we have in the country. You've run many marathons, ultramarathons, and so for you to have had this epiphany and this turnaround, and it must have been quite something for your followers and
Yeah.
students and everybody.
Absolutely, and for the first year, I didn't tell anyone. And they could see I'd lost this huge amount of weight. In the first year, I lost about 16 kilograms. I've subsequently lost about 4 more. But so they could see this transformation. And then I'd gone back to the weight I was when I was 18 or 19. And so people obviously asked, they thought, have you got cancer or not? So then they discovered it. But I really didn't know whether I was doing the right thing. But for me, it was amazing because my running went back 20 years.
Wow.
I went back from running as a 61-year-old back to what I was doing as a 41-year-old. And it was just, I can't tell you how fantastic that was. When I was running hard as a youngster, it was really hard for me to run a 3:45 kilometer. That was absolute flat out. And if I could do that for 16 Ks, that was my limits. So anytime I ran a 4-minute K, I was running fast. And I ran a marathon at 4 minutes a K.
Wow.
But I'd slipped right out to 7 to 8 minutes a K. On the diet, I went back to where I could do 5-minute Ks again. And I felt like I was running a 3:45.
And that was at the age of?
At 65, wow. 64, 65. Yeah. So I went back, but the key was I felt like I was running a 3:45 kilometer. Yeah. Whereas before, I felt like I was running an 8-minute kilometer. So for a person who runs a lot, that was just amazing. And I got all this energy back, and I had a whole bunch of other stuff that my wife said, your health just transformed. Within 6 weeks, you were a different person.
So let's go into the science of it. I mean, we have a lot of information in the film about it, but, we skirt over it. It's such a lot of information. And so the point of the summit is that we give people more to understand. So why did this work so well for you? And like kind of there's a lot of people say that carbohydrates are very essential. I mean, the controversy is still out there. A lot of people still don't take it that easily.
Yeah.
There's healthy carbohydrates that you get from vegetables, but the low-fat, high-carb, it's very controversial at the moment. So the science of it.
Well, what I learned was that there were all these studies showing that if you have insulin resistance, which is a pre-diabetic condition, and you eat a lot of carbohydrates, there's only one way you're going to go, and you're going to get diabetes. And that's what happened to me.
How do you get insulin resistance? What is it?
There are 2 theories about how you develop insulin resistance. The one is that we're all genetically the same. No one's at greater risk or lesser risk. But some people eat too much and they do too little exercise and they get fat, they develop insulin resistance and they get diabetes. And that is garbage. It's completely wrong. My experience, my father died of diabetes, type 2 diabetes, had all the complications. My uncle also had the complications of type 2 diabetes. That puts me at 10-fold greater risk. Now, ironically, my father ate a better diet than I did because he was from the north of England. And they introduced me to offal. We used to eat organ meats for breakfast. And Then I go to medical school and become clever. And I say, no, I can't eat that. And I switch to cereals and grains in the 1970s, late 1970s, thinking this is healthy. And all that happens is I get fatter and my running gets much worse. And then I discover I developed type 2 diabetes. But despite the fact that I run all these marathons, I was never grossly overweight. I was overweight, but I was never grossly overweight. I never drank. I never smoked. I was the epitome of what you're meant to do. I mean, I was the picture boy for telling people that they must be healthy. But it was really interesting because eventually I stopped talking about health about 10 years ago because I said, my own health is not good. So how can I tell other people about health? And if you look in Law of Running, there's not one, obesity doesn't even appear in the appendix or in the references because I didn't understand obesity. I read the literature and I said, but I can't understand what the story of obesity is. Today, having cured my own obesity, I know exactly what causes obesity. And I think that's what I find so frustrating is here I'm a quite well-known scientist in South Africa. I cure myself of obesity. I manage my diabetes as well as it's possible to manage it. And yet no one will listen. They still...
And you do have the scientific research. Since you started on that journey, you have looked into the proof and the research behind it. And how much of that is there? And
there is a massive literature taking this point, that if you have insulin resistance, the high carbohydrate diet will kill you. And I spoke recently in Australia at their diabetes conference. And we heard these other people talking about, you've got to exercise and that'll help you. And so on. Of course it does. And my exercise helps my diabetic control, but it can't normalize it. And I said to them, if you eat more than 25 grams of carbohydrate a day and you're diabetic, you're killing yourself. And if you're prescribing a high carbohydrate diet for diabetics, you're killing the patients.
Yeah.
Do you understand? Yeah.
That's fine.
Okay.
I hear you, what you're saying there. A lot of, can we go into the detail of exactly what comprises a high-fat, low-carb diet? I mean, do you have to just eat, and is it different for people that are insulin resistant and different for people that are just normal? I mean, there's no one diet fits all, is there? And, how does that apply to the general public?
You're quite right. There is no one diet that fits all, but that's what we're told. You see, if you go to a dietitian, you will get a standard protocol, and the lowest carbohydrate will be 40%, which will kill you if you're diabetic, or if you're insulin resistant, it'll drive you to diabetes. And what frustrates me is that insulin resistance is the most prevalent condition in the world. There are 2.1 billion fat people, and the majority of them will be insulin resistant. But in America, we know 50% have diabetes or prediabetes, which is a diagnosed insulin-resistant state. So we already know 50% of Americans are insulin-resistant. It means, and the other 50% haven't been tested, but many of them will develop either diabetes or prediabetes. So my prediction is about 70% of the population is insulin-resistant, either extremely insulin-resistant like myself or moderately insulin-resistant. And there's only probably 10% of the population who are completely insulin-sensitive. Now they can eat lots of carbohydrate and be healthy. But what they shouldn't eat is processed foods. They must still eat real foods. So we produced this book, The Real Meal Revolution, exactly a year ago today. And it sold 160,000 copies in 1 year, which breaks all South African publishing records. In a population where we only have 250,000 readers, we've sold 160,000 books.
I will concur and say that it has changed the outlook on eating for the whole of South Africa. Yeah. You accomplished your target there. I'm sure you heard a lot about it.
That's right. So our point about the real meal revolution is eat real foods. Don't eat processed foods. And of course you're going to have more carbohydrate, but just make sure, as you've indicated, that you eat vegetables and not too much fruit, because fruit's got a lot of fructose and it's got a lot of carbohydrate and it's sweet. But that's still fine if you're insulin sensitive. But if you're insulin resistant, people don't get it. I mean, I went to a conference the other day at the Medical Research Council, and I spoke about diabetes. And what was the present I was given? Sweets and chocolates. And I said, you really don't get it. That if you're diabetic or you're insulin resistant, you can't eat sweets, you can't eat chocolates, because they're addictive. Yeah. And they just make us sick and fat. And there's this So the diet I eat perhaps is extreme in the sense that I only eat 25 grams of carbohydrate. But it's extreme because it's unusual. Maybe 1% or less than 1% of the population eat like I do. But you have to, if you're sick, you have to eat that way.
Yeah.
And therefore it's not extreme, because I've got an extreme condition. I've got the type 2 diabetes is the worst disease you can have if you don't manage it properly.
Yeah. That's what I wanted to ask. I mean, okay, so insulin sensitivity, insulin resistance, is there a way of knowing if you have these? I mean, do you have to go for tests, or can you actually pick up symptoms in time?
Well, Robert Atkins, the genius who wrote The Diet Revolution in 1972, he was a complete genius because he didn't actually know the literature. He didn't understand that the low-carbohydrate diet goes back to 1852 in Banting. And he rediscovered it himself. And his book, his 1972 book, is utterly brilliant. There's nothing that I would add to it it's the best diet book ever written, because he understood the biology. Without understanding the biology, he got it right, because he saw these thousands of patients and he described their experience. And he was describing insulin resistance, and he said you go through these phases where eventually you're getting slightly fatter, you lose energy, you've got all these complaints, and you fall asleep in the afternoon, you become a bit angry and frustrated and cross with people. He described all, and then you get type 2 diabetes. It's all described.
Like the sugar crash.
Yeah, precisely. And he describes it all. And he said, you have to go off the carbohydrates for life. You see, that was the point. He understood that it's a genetic disorder that doesn't change. Whereas what we teach in medicine is that, oh, you just lose the weight and you become insulin sensitive. Of course you don't. You're still insulin resistant. And you still go back to the obese state if you reintroduce carbohydrates.
So coming back to my question, how does somebody know if they are insulin sensitive?
What happened in medicine was it got hijacked by the pharmaceutical industry, and particularly the cardiologists and their theory of the diet-heart hypothesis, which is that if you eat saturated fat, your cholesterol raises and it clogs your arteries. And there's just no evidence for that theory. It's really exciting because we're currently working on the biology of what happens when you eat saturated fat. Does it go to cholesterol? It doesn't. Cholesterol comes from carbohydrates. And it's when you're eating carbohydrates and you've got insulin that you produce cholesterol. Because cholesterol is an insulin-driven metabolic pathway. And the biologists just kind of, we won't worry about that one, we'll just kind of forget it. But that's the reality. So then that got hijacked. So what did we measure? We measured cholesterol. And as a clinical doctor treating patients, cholesterol is the most useless measurement you can have. It tells you absolutely nothing.
Yeah, I mean, one of our guys on the Johnny Bowden on the film, you know, he's one of the co-author of The Great Cholesterol Myth.
Absolutely.
You know, and you know, a lot of people, you know, cholesterol still kind of has a very bad, but you know, there's a balance. You need a certain amount, and there's certain cholesterol you don't want.
Yeah, exactly.
So insulin resistance, insulin sensitivity comes.
So what we really need to measure is your glycated hemoglobin, HbA1c, because that is an indirect marker of your insulin resistance and your carbohydrate intake. So you could be profoundly insulin resistant like I am, but eating a low carbohydrate diet and your HbA1c will be low. That doesn't mean you're not insulin resistant. In the face of a high carbohydrate challenge, if you are insulin resistant, you will have a high HbA1c. And the tragedy is, if we monitored HbA1c from birth to life, or throughout life, we wouldn't have to have diabetes at all. Because once the value goes over about 5.5%, that patient is heading towards diabetes. And if you cut the carbohydrates, they'll be fine. So value, you see, 6.5 means you've already got diabetes. Value of 6 is you're pre-diabetic, you're on the margins. So you've got this whole area between 5.5 and 6. And if you catch people within that range and drop their carbohydrate intake, you'll get them back to 5.5. They won't develop diabetes unless they get some inflammatory disease, which is a different type of form of diabetes. And if we measured HbA1c population-wide in the way that we measure cholesterol, we could really manage diabetes and prevent it from happening. And that's the great tragedy, because HbA1c not only predicts risk of diabetes, also dementia, cancer, a few other things. It just shows when your carbohydrate metabolism is messed up. That's when you become chronically ill.
And not enough fats is chronic, as Daniel Amen in our film also pointed out. for somebody like myself, I mean, I was very fortunate. I grew up on a small holding out of a little town in South Africa. I was blessed. I had, our own chickens. We had our own cows for our own milk and butter and everything. I was really lucky. I'm healthy. I'm fit. I'm active. I don't really have any problems, but I completely stopped wanting to eat bread and those kind of processed carbohydrates some time ago due to all the information I was understanding, and also just realizing my body wasn't enjoying it. So for people like myself, I mean, what are the carbohydrates? Because, there's lots of vegetables that, like the extreme paleo people will say, oh, no, those vegetables have a lot of carbohydrates, this and that. So, I mean, what are the carbohydrates that are good? Am I right in saying that if it comes from a whole food, you're good?
Incidentally, I can tell that you were brought up on a small island because you have a broad face and perfect teeth.
Okay.
And that's the key. So you had a lot of protein and fat and of course, you're very muscular and lean.
Wow,
and those are all characteristics of people brought up on farms. The interesting point in South Africa for the global population is that our best athletes, for the biggest, strongest athletes for our rugby teams, come from the farming community. And people used to say, well, it's genes, but it might well be genes. But those genes were exposed to lots of dairy and lots of protein and fat in their grain. And you get these huge guys. And they've driven South African sport for the last 100 years. It's the guys coming off the farms. So in your case, you want to know what carbohydrates you should be eating. Well, I think leafy vegetables are brilliant. And kale, particularly cauliflower, those sorts of are fantastic. But the underground storage organs like potatoes, perhaps not quite as good because they're just a bag of sugar. And that wouldn't be good for you.
Yeah,
so you need
a bit of a treat.
Yeah, you need the nutrient-dense vegetables,
okay,
which are the leafy ones which grow above the surface.
Great, because coming on to vegetables, I mean, we've got a lot of vegan people in the world, vegetarian people, meat-eating people, the whole broad spectrum, and everybody's entitled to eat what they want out of their own interests. For people that want to have this healthy high-fat, low-carb diet that are vegetarian or vegan, or people that just eat fish maybe, what is the solution for them?
Well, I fully understand why people want to be vegan and vegetarian. I absolutely support their beliefs about the way we care for animals, and 100% supportive. I think the biology, though, does suggest that humans do need some proteins from animal or fish sources. And I always say the healthiest people are the vegetarians who cheat on the side, and in other words, who are taking dairy, eggs, and fish. So, I mean, the paleo diet is not very different from a vegan diet or vegetarian diet, except it just adds the paleo doesn't have dairy, but the diet that we propose would include dairy, eggs, and fish. And you don't have to eat meat at all. And what I would suggest is you do need offal, you do need the animal organs, because they're the most nutritious as well. So someone who's eating vegetarian 3 days a week and 4 days a week, they're eating some of those proteins and fats, would be unbelievably healthy. What I normally say to vegans or vegetarians is it's fine if you're insulin sensitive because you're eating such a high carbohydrate diet. But if you're struggling with weight problems, which many vegetarians do.
You say you're fine if you are insulin sensitive.
You're fine if you're insulin sensitive because you won't put on weight.
Right.
But a lot of vegetarians struggle with their weight. And that's because they're eating so much carbohydrate. And you can't have a low carbohydrate diet easily if you're vegetarian. On the other hand, I have met some vegetarians who eat 70-80% fat. And they're not eating so much carbohydrate, they're eating lots of fat in exchange.
In what form?
Well, macadamia nuts, avocados, and coconut oil. Those are probably the three main sources. And if they eat dairy, they would have butter as well. And it is possible to eat a very high-fat diet. What would worry me there is where the protein's coming from. And again, the vegetarian proteins sources also have lots of carbohydrate. So anyway, to answer your question, if we do have a vegetarian who said absolutely not going to change, we would say then go the high-fat route and cut the carbohydrates as much as possible.
Yeah.
But there are some vegetarians who, for whatever reason, do very, very well. And We can't explain it because the diet is nutriently deficient. But they do very well. And this raises a really interesting question. That whenever I give a lecture, I show a slide of a lion and a panda and a koala bear and a giraffe. And I say, why don't these animals all eat the same foods? I mean, they're mammals. And the answer is that they co-evolved with different foods and the different gut bacterial flora. So the giraffe is this magnificent animal that eats only one plant, acacia plants. Now, if we were to take that acacia plant and analyze it, we'd find it's got no nutrients in it, almost none. So how does this animal get its iron, etc., etc.? Where is it getting it from?
I mean, yes.
And where it's getting it from the gut flora. Has to. There's no other way. So if I was a biologist, a veterinary biologist, I would try to work out how does the giraffe turn the acacia plant into all the nutrients that it requires. And that's perhaps a Nobel Prize in veterinary science if you can work that one out.
Because I was just on a shoot up in Africa.
Yeah.
I was in Rwanda. We
Yeah.
went to film the mountain gorillas.
Yeah.
And it's phenomenal. I mean, these gorillas are big, strong, healthy animals with huge canines.
Yeah.
And they're vegetarians,
Exactly.
mainly bamboo shoots and berries and things. And I mean, it's, for a lot of people, how does that work? I mean,
exactly.
And I think your answer is probably directly correct.
Well, 50%.
The microbiome
Yeah.
that lives inside of them.
Exactly. 50% of the fat is converted from carbohydrate in their gut. And so they don't eat fat, but they're getting it from the microbiome, as you indicated. And so my point is that there may well be some humans who've got a microbiome that can generate protein. I mean, it sounds stupid, ridiculous, and maybe it is ridiculous. They can generate the right nutrients from carbohydrate. I mean, it sounds ridiculous, but maybe it's possible.
And that just goes to show that, like I said before, no diet fits all,
Yeah.
So each individual really needs to hone into their own body, use their intuition, and learn how their body is working to find the diet that suits them best.
Exactly, and that's the point I try to make. So I've always focused on insulin resistance because the biology is absolutely clear. If you're insulin resistant, you cannot metabolize carbohydrates, and every time you add carbohydrates, you just mess up the system. So there, the biology is simple, and I could go to any court of law and argue it very clearly, and no one could say you're wrong. Now, okay, so then we move beyond that and say, okay, you're carbohydrate sensitive, what should you be eating? Then it becomes much more difficult. Yeah. And I would not be dogmatic on that one, but I'm profoundly dogmatic when it comes to insulin resistance.
Right. What is it about fat that is so important for us, whether you get it from macadamia nuts, coconut oil, or free-range animal products? What is it?
I think the reason we need fat is because we're biologically adapted for it, and humans used to search for it, and particularly, maybe not all humans, but certainly over the last 200,000 years from Pinnacle Point, that's where they seems to start, where they're collecting the mussels and the fish and the omega-3s. And we're all related to those pre-humans or Homo sapiens. So I think that's the reason. And if you look at the history of hunter-gatherers, they always went for the fatty foods. I've got a book about what people were eating in Cape Town, in this town, 200 years ago, and they were eating the fat from hippopotamus and elephant and rhinoceros. And fat was the preferred fuel. That was 200 years ago in Cape Town. You go to Cape Town now and see what they're serving. They're not serving the fat from hippopotamus. Yeah. So I think that it's either because it's the microbiome, it sets it up, or humans just have this natural need for fat.
Great. Organic food, food that is whole foods and not grown with all the modern agricultural technology and pesticides and fertilizers. The importance of that.
I think it's very important, the source where your meat and the fat on your meat comes from. And the suggestion is, and I fully support it, that it must be pasture-raised animals which are not fed corn and other carbohydrates. And I think that will become increasingly important. The people that I deal with and who look the healthiest are, firstly, they cook for themselves. Secondly, they eat this diet. And thirdly, they really know the source of the food. People like Steve Finney, who just looks like he's ageless. And he knows food like no one else I know. And he can tell you where the food, if it was pasture raised or not.
Professor Noakes, thank you so much. Your knowledge and how you really have revolutionized the people in South Africa, and joined the rest of the people that have been in the film. It's been fantastic. So thanks for joining us, and yeah.
It's a great privilege. Thank you so much. And to the rest of the world, let's keep pushing it. There's a lot of resistance to what we're doing, but if we want to save the human race, we really have to start looking at what we're eating, and that has to be the first port of call.